Nasser. Now we move, ladies and gentlemen, to the next panel, our third panel of the day, titled The Humanitarian Crisis, Relief and Development in Yemen. This panel was organized by the Washington Center for Yemeni Studies and the U.S. Council of Muslim Organizations. This discussion will be moderated by Mr. Oussama Jammal, who is the Secretary General of the U.S. Council on Muslim Organizations, USCMO, an umbrella organization of the national, regional, and local organizations. He's also the President and Chairman of the Board of the Mosque Foundation, Bridgeview, Illinois. Mr. Jammal, thank you so much for being with us. On to you.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Peace be on all of you. As you can see, our panel now is about humanitarian crisis in Yemen. But first of all, I would like to express my deep gratitude and thanks to the Washington Center for Yemeni Studies. I'm very honored to be attending this conference and very pleased to have the U.S. Council of Muslim Organizations co-sponsor or co-organizer of this event. You won't believe the great energy and vibrancy that I have seen through the young professionals that I work with, like Omar, Hussam and Mutanna and others as we prepare for this conference. Omar and I, we visited this place a couple of months ago, and maybe more than a couple of months ago, just in preparation. And I can see the energy in them. I can see the persistence, the pursuit for perfection. And I think they have done a great job and an amazing job in putting this together, considering all the challenges Yemen and Yemeni people suffer and go through. So please help me give them a hand for a good job that they have done so far. I cannot resist but to reflect a little bit, not going to take much time, on the panel before me, especially the presentation that was made with Mr. David Dirash and others. It makes me wonder how a country been under sanctions, boycott, siege for over 40 years was able to gain the upper hand over a country that has a coalition of the wealthiest countries in the region with open seas to the entire Western civilizations and industries of weapons and others, and could not do anything. It all reminds us of the very famous chart of President Trump of the billions of dollars of weapons that he prided himself of gaining, while the coalition gained nothing for themselves, let alone the Yemeni people. It makes me wonder, especially when I can see that even some of the coalition members have weakened the government and the legitimate representative of the Yemeni people. Makes me wonder. And I want you also to wonder with me, but I want you to draw your own conclusion. That is not the topic of our panel, but our panel is about humanitarian crisis. I don't think that we have seen as such tragedy and painful scenes of the Yemeni people. Yemen is supposedly Eden of earth. Aden, Jannatu Adnin, is supposedly, and it is. But some did not want it to be as such. And I just can pray for the Yemeni people to be able to reconcile. At the end, they are all Yemenis. They have to come to some sort of agreement that this is their country, this is their land, this is their people, with all the diversity that they have. Either they be wise and bring themselves together, or continue to be in the hands of the others. And God knows how long this will take, but I tell you, they got a lot of money, they have a lot of stamina to continue. And the cost will be your own people. And your own people, unfortunately, the panel would discuss the humanitarian crisis that we haven't seen much or many, or maybe we start to see more duplication of what's going on in Yemen. There's not a single country in the Arab world that is not suffering today. Give me one. Give me one foreign policy that worked in that region. None. So we are here to not to weep, not to drip some of our tears, but how we can work in the best that we can to help those under this duress. So I am very fortunate and honored to have a few of my panelists sharing this panel with me here. And I would like first to introduce Mr. Habib, excuse me here. I would like to introduce Mr. Habib Raja. Dr. Habib has over 13 years of experience designing and overseeing high-quality programming in countries including Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Sudan, Turkey, and Jordan. In addition, he has written proposals resulting in over $150 million in funding for humanitarian assistance, stabilization, and development programming from donors, including USAID, BHA, a lot of acronyms, and certainly the United Nations agencies. In his most recent position before UMR, which is United Muslim Relief, he has a humanitarian technical advisor based in Washington, D.C., responsible for supporting humanitarian programs, including the new business development process across Blue Moon's Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Afghanistan, and Colombia portfolio. During his career, he has held multiple senior leading management positions with the international leading agencies, including CARE. I want to make sure that it does not conflict or confuses with our own care. And SCI, CORDAID, RI, and ACF in Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Sudan, Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon, and has actively led designing proposals, strategies, and annual operations plans by providing political, contextual analysis, and technical support. Please help me welcome Dr. Habib Raja. While I'm still on the stage, let me introduce the second panelist, and then we will give our panelists to speak. I would like to introduce our next panelist. Sister Samar Nasser is the CEO of Yemen Aid, a humanitarian organization established in late 2016 in response to the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. She is a speaker and analyst on Yemen affairs. Mrs. Nasser has appeared on BBC, Al Jazeera, and PRI, and she has spoken alongside notable diplomats and experts. She was awarded a citation of merit by the Bronx Borough President Ruben Diaz Jr. Please help me welcome Ms. Nasser. Dr. Raja, you can take the first stand.
Good afternoon. Actually, at the beginning, I would like to thank Washington Center for Yemeni Studies for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here with you guys. And actually, this morning, when I was getting ready to come here, I would I started a dialogue with myself. I was asking myself a couple of questions. My kids were actually getting ready to go to school. But the question in my mind was, should I represent UMR? Should I represent myself? Should I come as a humanitarian aid worker, or should I come as a Yemeni? At the end, I decided to be both. And to understand the humanitarian context in Yemen, you have to understand the context, the politics, the history of the country. When we're talking about Houthis, we're not talking about a group or a movement that started decades. It's a movement and a group of people ruled Yemen for over 1,000 years. In 1962, a revolution in Yemen liberated Yemen from apartheid regime that enslaved Yemenis for decades and decades. And now Houthis are returning back to Yemenis to square one. They're seizing land, increasing the level of poverty in Yemen, radicalizing children, changing the curriculum, making the lives of women are more difficult. Even in universities now, women or girls can't put their pictures in their graduation ceremonies. So Yemen is now moving in the wrong direction. We used to be a developed country, now we're moving in the opposite direction. So, to stabilize Yemen, to talk about the humanitarian context, we should talk first of all about the government. The government of Yemen, and forgive me because I'm still wearing my sunglasses. Everything is dark here. The government of Yemen is weakened and every day is getting weaker and weaker. This is because not only of the conflict, but also because they don't have true, real allies. I wish the Yemeni government had an Iran ally that they're truthfully supporting as Iran supporting the Houthi movement. So, sorry to be, I would say, maybe talking about dark or, in a depressing way. But if we would like to save Yemenis, we have to learn from other conflicts in the world, from the Ukrainian crisis, from the Iranian, from the Somali, from the Iraqi conflict. To empower Yemenis, we have to focus in economic empowerment, giving the Yemenis access to income-generating activities. And United Nations donors and civil society organizations should move away from the traditional programs. We should move away from distributing food and instead of giving food, teaching Yemenis how to get their own income from different ways of different resources. Empowering youth economically, or in an economic way and social way as well. Empowering women and finding alternative way to share information. We have a good example from the Iranian uprising now, giving them access to internet, giving the Ukrainian people access to internet, to information, because the Houthi movement is actually relying on blinding, hiding informations. People in Yemen, they don't have access to most of the resources in internet. Most of websites that share information are blocked and they don't have access to them. And this is what will increase the radicalism among the Yemeni people. Every time I feel shocked when I see my colleagues, classmates, they talk in a ways that maybe people talk in the 7th century or the 10th century. They're talking about a group of people that have the ultimate right to enslave, rule people. Our role is to keep the education, the awareness among the Yemeni people alive through different resources, giving them access to internet, giving them access to information, empowering education programs. Sorry that because I'm talking in humanitarian, but maybe in politics as well, because I can't split politics from humanitarian as well. Sorry, guys. Also, when I'm talking about children in Yemen being abused by the Houthi movement, not only Houthi movement, but also by other groups. Military children or armed children are joining different groups. They're fighting in the front line, being attacked by different groups. And if we would like to save their lives, we have to make sure that these children are not moving in the wrong direction through proper education, continuous awareness, and developing maybe apps. Everybody has access to internet, but information should be reachable to these groups of people, children, women, and youth. Finally, when we're talking about the Yemeni crisis, we should talk about, supporting the economy. Learning from Somalia, Somalis are using mobile money, transferring money through mobile to another mobile. Yemenis suffering because they don't have access to actual money, printed money, because it's controlled by both sides of the conflict. The government has their own direction, while the Houthis have their own direction. And who's suffering in the middle? Yemenis. So I would advocate to find solution for the Yemenis to end the suffering. And I would like to highlight that we will not see a soon solution for the Yemeni crisis because it's a historical problem between Yemenis themselves, and they would need time to solve the problem. And we should hope that we can improve the lives of Yemenis and at least not to let the situation get worse. Thank you very much.
It's been a long day so far. We still have a few hours left to go. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today and for the kind invitation by the Washington Center for Yemeni Studies. And unfortunately, Yemen has, for decades, been suffering from negative media stereotypes, and it's perpetuated in part because Yemenis themselves rarely get to use their own voice, or their voice is either unheard or dismissed. And fortunately, this is not the case today. So I really want to applaud the Washington Center for Yemeni Studies for allowing us to come today to talk about, the country that we love the most. Sadly, unfortunately, I and my colleagues here in this panel have to discuss a very painful story that points the story of struggle and tragedy for Yemen and Yemenis alongside. And Yemen's humanitarian crisis has been catastrophic. But this is due really to two reasons. It's instability and economic downfall. And there are 4 million, unfortunately, internally displaced people. Yemen is obviously surrounded by water. We don't have the luxury of traveling or relocating to nearby countries, as with Syria, for example. There are, unfortunately, a lot of overwhelming suffering in freed provinces especially, and they are they lack a lot of sources and resources to support these IDPs. From the 30 million population, we have about 70% that need humanitarian support. Domestic travel has been extremely challenging for locals, and there's delays in transportation of goods, which logically that means that there will be increases in costs and increases of suffering of citizens, especially in the province of Taiz. But Yemen's situation really is twofold, and it should be approached with different lenses in various provinces, right? So from province to province, there are different needs. And the status quo projects that we see over the years, the typical humanitarian interventions, are not long-term solutions. But unfortunately, focus on urgent interventions with little effort to address sustainable development will only prolong the process. And in fact, when we look at statistics in the humanitarian file, there is an increase in needs despite billions of dollars coming in and pumping into the country and through organizations. But unfortunately, I can go on and on and on, but I'd like to take a pause here really and to remember that there are Yemenis who are united to confront these pressing issues, and all of them are here today alongside friendly allies, and they have supported and continue to support Yemen and Yemenis through their skills and resources. And Yemen needs all of us truly more than any time before. I run an organization called Yemen Aid, and it was started by Yemeni Americans, many of them in which we have one board member here, Abed Ayoub, who will be speaking later on in another panel, in which that we don't some of them haven't been to Yemen in a very long time. Our lens is purely how to respond. How can we, as a society and as individuals, take on what we have here in the West, and how could we build something better for Yemen? So we've supported so far about $17 to $18 million worth of support for Yemen, just for the most part as volunteers for the first couple of years. But I do want to talk a little bit about solutions, and ones that require innovative solutions, but also simple resolutions. I know we have to talk about the challenges today, and I was told to say a few words on it. I'm not going to lie to you here and pretend that everything is smooth. It's not. It takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of networking, and it takes a lot of connections to make sure that we get to where we need to be to support the average Yemeni. But there are complexities. So for example, as a challenge that we see is obtaining permits. Basic, right? So in Yemen, we have a very different political situation. In the north, you have Houthis, a de facto entity, and then we have the legitimate government in the south, and Houthis don't acknowledge licenses like ours, even though we are an INGO by the Ministry of Planning and Cooperation. And this creates issues of partnering and empowering others in the northern areas. We do have loopholes for that, obviously, which is to partner with local organizations in the ground rather than us directly. But in general, humanitarian organizations suffer from great complications in obtaining permits to renew activity or permits to implement projects on the ground. And in some government departments, it amounts to extorting organization to obtain personal benefits. And now let me make this clear. I'm not talking about the higher-ups, ministers, and they're very cooperative. I'm talking about local administrative individuals who sometimes may do things against policies within institutions that require them to actually support the process. Now, there are solutions to that, facilitating the procedures for obtaining permits and setting a short period of time for obtaining permits, or actually designing an electronic system through which permits are requested and obtained. And I think that's really important. I think if that's done in Yemen, I really do believe that we would see a lot of change on the ground. The next point is the weak extension of states' influence and weak security, which leads to exposure of some organizations' security issues having been done. And the issues are, let's say, cars are being stolen or impacted in terms of cutoffs and kidnappings of workers in the humanitarian sector. I think one of the most important solutions is establishing a hotline that would receive complaints from security organizations and respond and secure humanitarian organizations' top interests, which is at the end of the day helping those on the ground. So I think, in general, these are, and also just one more thing. One of my office managers gave me a thought about one of the challenges, and I don't know if it's appropriate to say this here, but there are recent complaints coming in from Yemen now that there are religious citations against organizations, like Humanitarian specifically, that push for radical individuals to create challenges for humanitarian agencies, in which, in some cases, create, like, for example, youth would, not youth, but in generally individuals would cut off roads. And this is something imperative, and it's been recent. I've seen this a couple of times. And I think this is important to tackle. Maybe the religious individuals or sheikhs or clerks can address this in a more appropriate manner. And then lastly is really emphasizing sustainable development. This is so important. Yemenis have so much abundance of food, but they just don't have the resources to actually purchase them. They don't have the purchasing power. So how we approach this is to try to, in fact, create a pathway to economic, empowerment through projects that can create a sense of dignity for Yemenis, in which they don't have to rely on organizations like us. I'm going to end this quickly, but I really am very sad that I'm here today talking about this topic. And I'm actually sad that we even had to come to a result of creating an organization like Yemen Aid, as much as it's a great thing. But this is not where we want to be as a nation. This is not where we want to be as Yemenis. And I wish one day I can say Yemen Aid is closed. Yemen Aid has done its job. Yemen is better. And now it's just a matter of capacity building and building those skills for Yemenis. But thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Okay, any questions from the audience? Could you please join us so that audience can address any questions that they may have to any of our panelists here? It's an opportunity. I think the humanitarian crisis is really at the core of this issue here. People are suffering. Political settlements and negotiations can drag, but the humanitarian crisis and need are immediate and now. So, any questions for our panelists?
There's a question here.
Yes, sir.
I'll try to speak loud. Can you talk about how to navigate political landscape while delivering humanitarian aid, not taking sides, maybe making unsavory partnerships? How has that been relevant in your work?
Should be for each one to give maybe a couple of minutes on your response to this question. I'm not going to make it for just one. For all of you, if anybody can give a 2-minute response to the question. How can you navigate? Okay.
So I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer this because I think this is more for the colleagues here working on a humanitarian field. But I think from a development perspective, if I could just refer to the World Bank in this situation, the bank works in all of Yemen. And they work through third party, basically the UN. So that's how they're navigating their work on the ground by partnering with other agencies.
That's a really complex question, by the way. You know, somebody who works in an organization that is trying to navigate those challenges, we have to have loopholes. And those, so for example, as I said earlier, that these loopholes, for example, in the north, if I would like to do a project in Sana'a, which is interesting because, you know, when we open up a project in Sana'a, and the Houthis technically don't really like Yemen aid because we have an INGO status with the legitimate government, they still come to our events, which is interesting. But we fund organizations on the ground and give them grants to avoid that legal issue. And I think number one, it's to empower, you know, community members and local NGOs, which is something we're proud of. But I think, you know, sometimes you have to, you know, think smarter, not harder. And I think in this perspective, if you cannot access it, there's somebody else who can. Just make sure you appropriately do your audits and transparency. And that's, you know, that's the way to approach it.
Totally agree with you. The Yemeni context is very complex, and there are areas that we can access. For example, the government control areas, normally it's accessible. And when it comes to Houthis, we normally work with partners. But the challenge is choosing the right partners, choosing the partner that have access, and finding the right partners to do the monitoring and evaluation as a third-party monitoring and evaluation. So to navigate through the system is normally we try to avoid by transferring the responsibility to another partner. And sometimes we take the long run and negotiate with the government, negotiate with the local authorities and the local leaders.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions here. One of them, I would love to take part of the answer, but certainly before me would be the panelist. They said over 100 U.S. lawmakers have called for the Saudi blockade in Yemen to be lifted as a humanitarian act for the sake of millions of Yemenis in need. They rejected the collective punishment by the coalition and say that the lives of Yemenis should never be used as a bargaining chip. Do you agree or disagree with these members of Congress, and why or why not do you support this position? I know this is now, as I said, it is really, you know, politics and humanitarians are interconnected, and one influences the other. Anybody willing to answer that question? Yeah. Oh, please.
Actually, to answer this question, I should wear one of my hats. The first hat, if I'm a Yemeni and I'm not a really humanitarian aid worker, I totally disagree with them. Because I think to end the Yemeni crisis, one side should win and we should empower the government, and we should actually continue the, I would say, the military operation. But when I remove my hat as a person, and I wear my hat as a humanitarian aid worker, yes, saving life is important, and access to humanitarian services shouldn't be negotiated because it's a basic right for the people. This including, for example, the airport, Sana'a Airport, Hodeidah Airport, Taiz roads, accessing people, ability to access and travel. So, yeah, we cannot split humanitarian from politics, but it depends on the person who's answering the question.
Well, I tell you one thing is, it is unfortunate, and look, we live in a free country. We can speak, and our elected officials would love to hear, contrary to some may think that they don't want to hear. Again, this is America, and we are very proud to be Americans, and therefore, we are entitled to our opinions and also to hold our government and elected officials accountable. It is unfortunate that American Yemenis, when the crisis erupted, they were denied, or let's say delayed, evacuation from Yemen until we had to go to the State Department and press them that those are Yemeni Americans. They need to be evacuated like anybody else that we evacuate from war-torn zones and dangerous zones. We had to push them for this. And as Americans, I tell you, you are taxpayers. You have to connect with your members of Congress and push them to provide humanitarian aid much more than what they are giving today. Whatever we collect through these very modest humanitarian organizations are only a drop in the bucket. They will not do much. Certainly your spirit of supporting the people who are in need, and I know you, Yemeni community, not only to Yemen, you give everywhere. You give to the Syrians, you give to the Iraqis, you give to the Afghani, you give to the Libyans, you give everybody. So we have an obligation as American citizens and taxpayers to press our Congress and our government to provide equal opportunity aid to Yemen like we do with everywhere else. I'm not gonna name names of countries, but recently, every week and every day, there's a new package of billions of dollars went in aid. And Yemen is suffering. And most of them are our allies, what we call the moderates in the region. So I think we have a little bit more than just talking about the suffering of the Yemenis. We have to be part of the solution. We have to be part of pushing, despite the grim look and situation in Yemen, I'm very hopeful with the young faces that I've been working with on this conference that they are the future of Yemen. It may take a little time, but hopefully the future of Yemen in the hands of these young people will be much brighter than what we see today. There was another question. A recent independent study showed that weaponizing the humanitarian aid response in Yemen by donor states like Saudi Arabia, UAE, what steps can be taken to press NGOs to behave more responsibly in Yemen to ensure that the population receives the support they need, but are also empowered to have a say over their future. I don't know if the question is but anyway, weaponizing humanitarian aid, definitely that is unacceptable. And I don't think anyone in the room here would accept weaponizing humanitarian aid for anybody, friends and foes. You cannot use humanitarian aid to press other people. Yes, sir.
I have a question, but first, thank you for the work that you guys do. We talk a lot about what we do for Yemen, and multiple organizations work real hard to ease the sufferings of Yemen and the Yemenis. The question is, as Yemeni organizations, how do we take back the picture to the United States, to the United Nations, as multiple organizations work in Yemen and see the suffering, do we have a collective effort from multiple organizations to take one voice to United Nations, to United States, and how does that work, and how successful, if it's done, what's the rate of success if we are getting a response from, you know, the pictures that you guys bring back?
Thank you. This is really an important question. And to answer this question, I would say the problem with Yemeni organizations, not all, but majority, that their way of working is still with a charity mentality. They don't work in close coordination with the United Nations. They don't participate in the clusters, and they're out of the system. So if you're out of the system, you can't raise your voice. You can't advocate. If you're not showing your face, nobody would know about the problem. So my answer or advocacy here for the Yemeni organizations to restructure themselves, to adhere to the humanitarian principles, and to make sure that they show their faces in these international forums at the Yemeni level, and then also at the levels here as well. For example, I've seen, I would say, tons of Yemeni organizations, but they're rarely participating in conferences with the United Nations or conferences in interaction. So this is, I think, the problem, that we keep talking between ourselves, among ourselves, but we never share what we have with others.
I have one, thank you. I think an excellent question. So one of the biggest challenges with Yemeni organizations, let's say here in the United States, it could be social, could be humanitarian, whatever it may be, as long as it's an entity, is that we have to learn how to institutionalize ourselves and position ourselves to not only do our mission, but to also advocate through a policy lens. So for example, you know, hopefully I work with other Yemeni American partners, and I welcome anybody who, but I really believe one of the biggest challenges, and maybe a solution is, not a challenge, but a solution is to create a task force, is to create a committee or a task force of Yemeni American organizations, humanitarian, social, whatever it may be, and we all sit on a table and talk about how can we, you know, approach the UN. We are, as an entity, we struggled with that in the beginning. But we are part of the UN clusters, and we are, you know, positioning ourselves in that way, and it's very difficult. You're dealing with politicizing of aid, as a moderator had shared. There's a lot of corruption. You question your stance of ethics in that sense, where we've had to actually stop our projects because we just don't adhere to those unethical behaviors. We've approached the UN OCHA, this is recorded, multiple times to approach them in a way that we find is appropriate. It's challenging. It's not just the agencies, right? You're dealing with representatives that represent these agencies on the ground. There's actually systematic racism within these agencies, I'm gonna be honest. And this is something I've seen a couple of times and had experiences with. So I think one of our goals as individuals, as Yemeni American, is to approach that. We don't stand for this. We have to, do not stay quiet about it. If you stay quiet, it just creates the cycle again. But I think definitely a task force is huge. If we can do that, I welcome any organizations to sit down and we talk about these issues and we raise it up and we bring it to those who have authority.
Maybe from a different angle, that's a really excellent question. You know, one thing that we always need to keep in mind that the international community, whether it's the US or the UN or else, have a very short attention span. So today's Yemen, tomorrow is another crisis, and we keep shifting. I think the question for us as Yemenis is how to keep Yemen on the agenda, how to keep it live, and to move away from that security lens, because that's how Yemen has been seen for many years, is through the security lens. And now it's shifted a little bit to humanitarian, but I think we need to change the narrative around Yemen into opportunities too. Yemen is not only about humanitarian crisis, there are opportunities in Yemen. And the question is how to capitalize on these opportunities to give a different kind of narrative that you're not only just pumping money into Yemen to keep the Yemeni alive. No, we want Yemenis to be productive, to contribute to their country and to the whole world. And so that kind of narrative also needs to be changed going forward. But I really applaud the work of all my colleagues here at the humanitarian field. Thank you.
I think I have the last question here, and after that, I think our time is up. But this is, I think, very relevant to the economic situations. They said in light of the inflation and aid reduction, what kind of impact that you see on your work and how you see that you can navigate through the economic difficulties these days?
Yeah, so we deal with a lot of currency changes every day, every second. So from an organizational lens, you're talking about procurement policies, in which, for example, and I'm talking about from a budgetary perspective. As you implement a project, you need closed envelopes, but one of the biggest, I think two of the biggest issues is when we finalize on an agreement with, let's say, a donor organization, and those budgets, we always say those budgets can change. We have to always negotiate back and forth with these organizations that, in which we have to always put ourselves explaining what's going on. And so from an organizational and a donor perspective, this impacts us. And then also, even from the ratio of admin costs, right? This is a big topic right now, and a lot of criticism goes around this, is about admin costs for organizations. They're crazy high. Some of the reasons are really inexcusable, in my opinion. And then there are some smaller organizations who end up having to raise those costs because of those inflation challenges, or security challenges, in which that impacts our security of our team. So I think just unfortunately going with the flow of the currency, it's very different even from Aden and from Sana'a, very big difference. But it's just a matter of us keeping sharp in response to what the changes are every day. I'm a firm believer that the humanitarian crisis is an economic one. If we really, really focus on the economic side, we can help big time on Yemen's humanitarian crisis.
I'll also give it a brush. So thank you. I think that's also another excellent question. I think there's the inflation side of things, but there's also other challenges in Yemen. One of them is having a more than one macroeconomic policies in the countries, which you don't see it in many other countries in conflict, but in Yemen, it's add to the complexity of the situation. The currency keep fluctuating, so if you want to even support today, the Yemeni riyal keep fluctuating. So that's a very big challenges for everybody who works in Yemen, but also for the Yemenis. And then adding into it transportation cost. If we're talking about the food security crisis in Yemen, it's not only about the food, but it's also about how you get produce from point A to point B, and it's very challenging. So I think it goes beyond just the global inflation that we talk to into more contextual issues on the ground that needs to be addressed in a very specific way to see how you could really actually give the support needed to the people with just maximizing your impact on the ground.
I think with that, we come to a conclusion. Please thank our panelists for sharing their thoughts, and thank you for your listening.